Okay, everybody. So I'd like to get started now. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's CSSGJ talk. I am Oliver Dodd, a co-director of the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. The CSSGJ is a left-wing research centre based in Nottingham, holding public events and workshops related to matters of social and global justice. Today, we are very pleased to be hosting this public talk given by Robert Griffiths, who is the General Secretary of Britain's Communist Party. In addition to his work in the communist movement, Rob has been active in the trade union struggle for decades. He was a president of the trade union TAS and more recently has been the chair of the Left Leave Lexit campaign. In terms of publications, Rob has written a number of biographies, one of which was on the Welsh MP and mining leader, Stephen Owen Davies. More recently, in 2018, Rob published a book titled Marx's Das Kapital and Capitalism Today, a work of political economy which commemorates the 200th year anniversary since the birth of Karl Marx. Rob regularly writes for the Morning Star, which is the only democratic left-wing English language newspaper in the world. The title of today's talk is The Communist Party and the Case for Socialism. Rob will be speaking for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and this will be followed with approximately 30 to 40 minutes for the Q&A. Rob, many thanks, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Good evening, everybody. The title I was given for tonight's discussion is The Communist Party and the Case for Socialism. And I've actually taken that to mean an emphasis on what the Communist Party specifically has to say in terms of the case for socialism, what is distinctive, perhaps, and characteristic about the case for socialism that we would make, whilst recognising, of course, that there's a broader case for socialism that any of us might be putting in our own different ways, whether in an individual conversation or at a political or trade union meeting and so on. So, in other words, I've taken as my starting point what the Communist Party has to say in making the case for socialism that is unique to, or at least characteristic of, the Communist Party. Of course, there are different ideas about what socialism actually is. Different parties, different political activists and philosophers will put forward different conceptions and definitions. The Communist Party defines socialism as a society in which the major sectors of the economy and key enterprises are in social ownership and planned for the benefit of the mass of the people and society and the planet as a whole. This is a definition of socialism, of its economic basis, I think broadly accepted by many on the left. Of course, a socialist society would have other distinctive characteristics, social, cultural, political, about which there would be plenty of room for disagreement between socialists and people on the left. But in making the case for socialism, however we define it, I believe we have to take present-day society, which shapes so many people's ideas and views, as our starting point. Many people know that economic, social and environmental problems exist. They don't need to be lectured patronizingly about the evils of capitalism when either they or their family or their friends or their neighbours or their workmates will only be too aware of the deficiencies in our present society, although of course they may not see them as deficiencies of capitalism as such. And therefore we have to, I think, show people that capitalism is by its very nature an unfair, exploitative, oppressive and destructive system which does not serve the interests of humanity. Of course, there are individual and human weaknesses and failings and so on that can bring misfortune to people. And that can happen in any system of society. It depends how that society copes with those situations. But I think our particular task and responsibility as socialists and communists is to show how those problems in their generality stem from the very nature of the system, which is something that has to be exposed and explained very often. For the Communist Party, our explanation flows from our Marxist analysis of capitalism and its class-based exploitation and oppression of workers in general, and of specific groups of workers, women, immigrants, third world labour and so on in particular. We have to show that gross inequality, deprivation, lack of opportunity, unemployment, waste, environmental degradation, crisis, militarism and a tendency to war are intrinsic features of capitalism. They are systemic. More specifically, we have to explain how and why the drive of the giant monopoly corporations to maximize profit is a necessity for them, and so often a disaster for those workers and communities and countries which stand in the way. We also have to show how this system is protected, promoted and maintained by the use of state power, how the apparatus of the state is used, sometimes with subtlety and even concessions, to serve the interests of the giant corporations that monopolize every sector of the modern capitalist economy, and how in particular the state apparatus is used to serve those monopolies based in its own country. Basing our understanding on the analysis developed by Kautsky, Lenin, and later 20th century thinkers, economists in particular, the Communist Party uses the term state monopoly capitalism to explain how the economic power of the capitalist monopolies has in effect fused with the political power of the state, reinforcing one another. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that when just putting the case for socialism, as I say, to people in the pub or to a small meeting or whatever, I'm not suggesting that we rush straight in with terms such as state monopoly capitalism. But I think what's important for our understanding is that we're clear that this, in effect, this combining of the economic power of the capitalist monopolies with the political power of the state, how this is at the root of many of the great problems facing our society. I'll take one small example. It's in the headlines at the moment: corruption. The corruption of politicians being sponsored or funded by economic interests, repaying that sponsorship, all those company directorships, and those well-paid consultancies, reciprocating with policies, with contracts, with grants, with seats in the House of Lords, reciprocating that generosity shown by the big corporations, their boards of directors and so on. This is not a new problem. It wasn't invented even by Boris Johnson and his cabinet. In fact, the root of this corruption, which is widespread in our society, the root of this corruption lies in that combination, that fusion of the economic power of the capitalist monopolies and the political power of the state and the political parties, of course, that take office in the government of that state. Only by taking state power from the capitalist class, from the big capitalists who own the biggest monopolies and whose interests dominate the policies of governments and the state, only by taking state power from the capitalist class can the working class and its allies begin to dismantle capitalism and construct socialism. All the enormous resources of our society, human, natural, technical, and they are enormous, can be planned instead and developed and reproduced to meet the needs of humanity, including the well-being of our planet and the natural world. But that will also mean taking control of these resources, bringing them into democratically accountable social ownership so that they can be planned and developed sustainably for the benefit of all. As the 1,000 and more scientists who composed or reviewed the 15th report of the UN Panel on Climate Change put it, rapid and far-reaching transitions on an unprecedented scale, unquote, are urgently needed in industry, transport, energy, land use and construction if we're going to rescue our planet from the mortal threat of global warming. Though such rapid and far-reaching transitions can only mean social ownership, economic planning, and democratic involvement and accountability. Of course, there was no possibility that those scientists in an official UN report to be endorsed by many governments around the world, there was no way, I suspect, that they would have labelled these transitions, in effect, socialism, even if they'd wanted to. But that is the only interpretation that I think socialists and communists can place on that particular formulation. For the Communist Party, as for Marx, Engels and Lenin, taking state power in order to carry through such enormous transitions, that taking of state power is the essence of revolution. How this state power will be taken out of the hands of the capitalist class will depend on the conditions and circumstances as they unfold in each country and on each continent. The revolutions in Russia, China, Czechoslovakia, Cuba, Vietnam arose in very different conditions and took very different forms in those countries. It's unlikely that the transfer of state power in Britain and in its constituent nations will be a rerun of Russia in 1917, or Czechoslovakia in 1948, or China in 1949, or Cuba in 1959. And the model of socialism we might envisage and attempt to construct will likewise be different in many important features from the Soviet model, or the Yugoslav model, or the Chinese model today. Marx did not leave us a blueprint, either for socialist revolution or for the socialist society, or the lower form of the lower stage of communism, as Marx would have put it. Although the principles of working class state power, social ownership and economic planning are universal. But comrades, we are leaping ahead of ourselves. What the Communist Party has to say about the struggle for socialism today is distinctive in some important respects. Firstly, in our view, and this is expressed in our programme, Britain's Road to Socialism, we have to expose the motive force and the anti-social, anti-democratic, anti-working class, anti-people, anti-planet policies of the capitalist monopolies and the state power which serves their interests. Secondly, we have to explain why socialism alone can solve the basic problems of humanity, replacing the contradictions and crises of capitalism with social justice and sustainable development. Our vision of socialism must show that it will be profoundly democratic and will use science and technology to liberate workers and serve the mass of the people and not intensify their exploitation. Thirdly, we have to learn lessons from the past failures and limitations of social democracy and of the previous attempts to build socialist societies. Our programme, Britain's Road to Socialism, devotes considerable space to reviewing those experiences with a view to learning lessons from them. Fourth, we have to strengthen the organisations of the working class. By the way, the working class is something that certainly the Communist Party defines broadly. It's all those who in the past, present or future rely on labour power as their primary source of income. So we have to strengthen the organisations of the working class, whether workers by hand or by brain, notably the trade unions, at every level, emphasising the need for unity, solidarity, and militancy based on political analysis and education. Fifth, we have to strengthen those progressive movements which challenge the reactionary and regressive features of capitalism and which challenge, therefore, the prerogatives of the capitalist monopolies. And the organisations of the working class have a vital role to play in strengthening those movements and uniting them and bringing them together. Which brings me to, I think, the sixth distinctive point of the Communist Party's outlook. We have to develop and win support for a realistic but revolutionary programme that shows how an alliance of progressive movements led by the organised working class can be built, and one that will challenge state monopoly capitalism and open the road to socialism. And seventh, and pardon the party political broadcast coming at the end perhaps, of course I am bound to say, and I profoundly believe, that we must build a revolutionary party, the Communist Party, which has stood the test of time since its formation in 1920, which is unbreakably committed to socialist revolution, rooted in the working class, active and influential on every front of working class and popular struggle, internationalist in its outlook and its affiliations, which sees the political class struggle in Britain as part of the wider struggle against imperialism around the world, including not least British imperialism. And in making that case for a much stronger and more influential Communist Party, that is certainly not to deny the essential role that will be played by other forces and organisations on the left, by working class organisations, and by progressive movements that need to be brought into an alliance with them. So I'm sorry if I dare say I know there are important areas of organisation, activity and struggle that I haven't included in my initial remarks. I hope and I believe we've got enough time now left for my omissions to be pointed out and for us to have perhaps some deeper discussion on some of the important questions that I have raised, as well as some of those that I haven't yet raised. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for giving that talk, Rob. Nice balance there between theory and practice. So I'm sure everyone else will agree that was really interesting, and looking forward to going into the Q&A now. So we're going to start off with a few questions in the chat, and then we'll move to anyone who would like to ask a question directly to Rob via video. I'm going to limit the question itself to about 2 minutes, just because we've got quite a few people in the chat, and I will be strict about that 2 minutes. So yeah, first of all, I go to the chat. I've got a question from somebody called Bill Greenshields, who says, who wants to ask, how could the working class maintain democratic control of the socialist state following a successful revolution and transfer of state power? How would such democratic control be exercised at work and in local communities?
Well, of course, I know Bill very well, and he would always have a range of challenging questions, quite rightly. The revolution and the revolutionary movement and the revolutionary government, of course, has to be able to defend itself, because otherwise the price that could be paid by socialists, by communists, by all those who want to see real change and real progress can be a terrible one, as we've seen with the attempts at counter-revolution immediately following the revolution in Russia and the formation of the Soviet Union, as we saw with the failed attempts at socialist revolution in Hungary and Bavaria immediately after the First World War, and as we saw, of course, in Chile in the early 1970s. So our party program does give some serious attention to this question of how a socialist government, a revolutionary government, how it can maintain its position, how it can defeat attempts at counter-revolution. And the first thing I'd say, first of all, a process of revolutionary change cannot be entered into with illusions. The reality is that the capitalist class facing dispossession will resort to any means possible in order to prevent the dismantling of capitalism and the construction of socialism. And that can happen in countries with long traditions of parliamentary democracy, as well as in other countries that don't have those traditions. The capitalist class, as we've seen from many of the activities, including the wars of British imperialism around the world, the capitalist class in Britain, for example, would be as ruthless in defense of its interests as other capitalist classes would be, and probably more than most. This means that the greatest thought has to be given to ensure that the revolution continues to advance and is able to defend itself. And ultimately, its power comes from the organized working class and from the people and from their movements. And therefore, again, to embark on a revolutionary process, is not a part-time hobby. It's not one for Toy Town revolutionaries either. It's a very, very serious business. And as I say, our program, I believe, takes this very seriously. We have to look at which parts of the capitalist state have to be abolished immediately, which parts can be reformed and turned to other purposes, which can be amended. We have to look at how we can strengthen working class and popular organizations, how we can bring them into the process of exercising power, how we can show to people that this is their revolutionary process. This is bringing them real change that means huge benefits for them and their families and their friends and their workmates and so on. So the popular base of the revolutionary advance has to be constantly strengthened and renovated and renewed. And again, we can look at other experiences of socialism to see how this might be done. I was very impressed when I went to Cuba a few years ago by the activities of the committees for the defense of the revolution, based in local neighborhoods that involved people in real decision making and involved them in exercising power over those elements that sought to abuse their positions, dealing with, for example, in one case that I saw with my own eyes, dealing with domestic violence and so on. So what working class and popular organizations can be brought fully into the revolutionary process, into the decision making, into the exercise of power, because ultimately that is where the revolution will draw its strength from, and that is the way that will be the only basis on which it can defend itself. That includes, by the way, a military policy. We would have to see how workers' organizations, self-defense organizations can also be involved. It may well be that maintaining an elitist professional army is actually providing a potential weapon for counter-revolution. On the other hand, the socialist state must be able to defend itself against external enemies as well as internal enemies and so on. What would we do about the intelligence services? What would we do about police and army and military chiefs whose sympathies do not lie with the revolutionary process? They would obviously need to be replaced. So I don't know if that's it's certainly not a short answer to your question, Bill, but the need for the revolution to defend itself internally and externally is something that all revolutionaries have to take very seriously, because, as I say, this is not a game, and in any revolutionary process and in any attempts at counter-revolutionary violence, we know that it will be the revolution and its supporters, the working class, the ordinary people, who will pay the heaviest price if we haven't taken these questions seriously enough before we embarked upon a real process of fighting for and taking and holding state power.
Thank you for that very detailed response there, Rob. We've got many more questions in the chat, which I'm sure speaks to how interesting your talk was. So I'll go for the next question. And if you'd prefer to take 2 or 3 at one time, just let me know. So Noah asks, why communism and not Swedish-style social democracy to combat social and economic inequalities? Shall I ask you a couple more?
Yeah, 1 or 2 more. Yeah.
And then Alice says, as the People's Republic of China enters a new era and advances towards becoming a modern socialist economy by 2049, what lessons has the Communist Party of Britain taken from China's recent achievements, and how can those lessons be creatively applied to the specifics of Britain's material conditions?
Whoa. Well, some absolutely excellent and central questions. Firstly, because we believe that ultimately a revolutionary transfer of power is needed, and the building of a completely different form of society based on a completely different economy is also essential. That doesn't mean that we should dismiss the importance of making gains and winning improvements and achieving reforms now. To say that anything short of revolutionary change is worthless or a diversion and so on is just, well, Lenin would have called it childish ultra-leftism. People want to see improvements and want to see real changes now. And sometimes it's possible to bring about reforms and changes which strengthen the position of the working class, of the labour movement, of popular organisations, strengthens their position for the struggles to come and the bigger struggles to come. So, for example, the Communist Party has always been at the forefront to win improvements in trade union law, to achieve rights for trade unions, to have those entrenched in law without having any illusions about, the law itself. It's not neutral, we understand that. But to have legally enforceable rights which help trade unions to organise, help them to recruit, which improve rights and health and safety and wages and pensions. Of course, this can only be used to strengthen the position of the working class and to show to people themselves the potential strength that they have for even more fundamental change. Of course, the danger, and it's the trap that social democracy invariably ends up falling into, is to see these reforms and improvements as an end in itself, sometimes even to redefine them as socialism, when in fact they're not. And I would say that is the position as far, for example, as social democracy in Sweden is concerned. Yes, there have in the past been big gains for workers in terms of their living standards, their wages, their rights, a role in some level of decision making and so on. But I don't think we should ever mistake that for socialism, because the reality is that many of those gains have been rolled back. The capitalist class and the state apparatus will always be looking at ways of clawing back the concessions they've been compelled to make or thought it was necessary to make. And if we look at Sweden today, I don't think anybody could describe Sweden as a socialist society. The major sectors of the economy, most of them, are in the hands of capitalist enterprise. There is still an inequality. There are, in fact, a growing number of social problems that are developing in Sweden. It's gone backwards since the gains of the 1950s and 60s and early 1970s. I'm afraid this is what happens, particularly when we confuse the question of government with power. To have a social democratic government party in office is not the same thing as having a socialist government in power, having taken state power out of the hands of the capitalist class. So social democracy has brought gains, it's brought benefits, but it has not gone forward then to challenge the fundamental ownership and control of the economy and the political power structures that are based on that, in particular the state. And very often, of course, a lot of these kind of measures, certainly in Britain, public ownership, economic planning, government intervention in the economy, these have actually been used to strengthen capitalism, to rescue capitalism, in fact, after the Second World War in particular. So I don't think we should confuse social democracy with socialism, just like we shouldn't confuse office with power. China, of course, is very, very interesting. The capitalist propaganda would have us believe that the undeniable progress made on so many fronts in China is entirely due to China supposedly embracing capitalism and capitalist enterprises and capitalist market forces and so on. And that everything that they say is still wrong with China is because while China has embraced capitalism economically, it still maintains its old socialist and communist structures and communist party rule, which explains all the negative features that they claim exist in China. Well, you know, you don't have to go somewhere to learn something about it. I never went to apartheid South Africa, but we had a pretty good idea what that system was all about. But I have been fortunate to go to China, to travel extensively, to meet trade unions at every level, enterprise level, and at central level, the central organization of China's trade unions. I've met Communist Party officials at every level. I've met local government officials. I've been to factories. I've been to local communities. I've been to some of the far-flung provinces of China, including Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur people are, and so on. And I think that, together with reading and learning, I think has certainly improved my knowledge of China. And it didn't take long to discover, of course, that the idea that China is a capitalist country or that its economy is predominantly capitalist is complete and utter nonsense. Key sectors of China's economy, finance, construction, large sections of manufacturing, most of the big Chinese enterprises operating around the world are in public ownership. They are still in public ownership. The driving force in deciding what kind of economic development takes place, and therefore social development takes place in China, the driving force is still the central economic planning mechanisms that exist in China. They invite capitalist enterprises into the Chinese economy, yes, on a basis, of course, that allows them to earn a profit, otherwise they wouldn't come, but also on the basis which helps China to develop its economy and its society, and incidentally to learn and to acquire much of the advanced technology that those companies have to bring with them. When they've outlived their usefulness, they are superseded by Chinese companies, as I say, many of which are in public ownership. So Communist Party rule, economic planning, public ownership of key sectors of the economy in China, up to and including the present day. These have been the really essential features of China's enormous transformation over the past 40 years. Of course, there are dangers. Market forces do operate in China, although they're only within the context of the overall economic plan and its objectives. But nevertheless, there are capitalists in China. There are Chinese capitalists in China, as well as foreign capitalists. There are market forces. Inequalities have grown in certain respects. The housing market has been very problematic that's developed in China. And therefore, when I've met with our comrades in the Chinese Communist Party, I haven't been backward in coming forward and saying, well, we can't teach you anything about building socialism. We can learn lessons from you about building socialism, but we do have some experience of monopoly capitalism, and we have some experience of its ill effects. We know what a free market in housing can do in terms of providing decent houses, or failing to provide decent houses at affordable rents for everybody who needs them, and so on. And therefore, our party, we've discussed the dangers of capitalist market forces and capitalist companies operating in China. We've discussed those with our Chinese comrades. And I must say, they have been very respectful and very appreciative of us raising those points with them. We've discussed the question with trade unions, who of course are operating in China within these capitalist concerns. The United States wanted to boot China out of the World Trade Organization when China decided that all of these foreign capitalist enterprises should have Communist Party cells operating within them, as well as trade union organization operating within them, and so on. So all these are live questions in China. And yes, I think we could learn lessons from China. Yes, acquiring technology, including from capitalist enterprise, can be a very necessary stage in China's progress towards socialism. But having said all of that, we will move towards socialism in our own conditions. In Britain, we will build a different kind of socialist society. It may have some features in common with China, but we're not going to have a 1949 style revolution in Britain. And of course, there will be many competing forces and parties and so on when it comes to the politics of a new socialist society in Britain.
Thanks for that detailed response, Rob. We've got a lot of questions in the chat, really good questions as well. I'm impressed with the quality that's coming from a lot of people. I'll go to the next question. I'll just take them one by one until really we've run out of time. So James Grant is asking, how do we overcome the entrenched belief that a leader needs to be in control, i.e. how do we ensure real-time accountability?
Well, again, we look at the different attempts to build socialism in different countries, and we're very conscious after our experience of fascism and the threat of fascism. We're very conscious of the danger of dictatorial tendencies arising wherever there may be political power, and therefore how leadership is exercised and how it is made accountable and how it is exercised within limits. These are very important questions too. And I think quite rightly on the left in Britain we have, and in the communist movement generally, with some notable exceptions, we of course, we uphold the principle of collective leadership. Accountable leadership, leadership that can be changed when people believe it should be changed and must be changed. These are important lessons that we can learn from communist history as well as from history generally. We also have to understand how and why what perhaps we could call, maybe a little crudely, cults of personality can arise. Nelson Mandela was quite rightly revered in South Africa for the role he had played in the liberation struggle. And of course, he was the president of South Africa after being released from prison and the downfall of apartheid. At the same time, Mandela never attempted to grossly exceed his power under the constitution of the new South Africa. Others have exceeded those powers. We've seen the same tendencies arise in the past in the Soviet Union. And that only underlines the importance of collective leadership, and collective leadership that's democratically accountable. I don't necessarily mean by some traditional Western model, but is genuinely accountable to those to whom leaders are attempting to give leadership to. At the same time, this whole concept of leadership, of course, is a little problematic because one of the lessons of the Soviet Union surely is that the failure to consistently involve the mass of the people and the mass of the working class and the organizations of the working class, the failure to involve them fully in decision making and the exercise of power at every level, of course, meant that when the mortal threat arose to the fundamentally socialist system of the Soviet Union, many people did not feel committed enough to that system to go out and defend it. And that's got to be one of the great lessons that we have to learn from that particular experience. So concepts of leadership can be problematic, but at the end of the day, decisions have to be taken, and then those decisions have to be put into practice. They have to be enforced, they have to be defended, but they also have to be reviewed to see what lessons can be learned, perhaps because they weren't the right policies, or they weren't implemented in the right sort of way. So this whole question of socialist democracy and how you exercise it, and how you exercise it when there are still forces actively engaged internally and externally in trying to block and overthrow the revolutionary process. These are big questions. These are really big questions. And I have to say, how we organize and how we exercise democracy in our own organizations, whether in socialist parties, the Communist Party, trade unions, of course, is something that we also have to be acutely aware of and ensure that that leadership is being exercised in a way that is directly accountable and, if necessary, removable. These are important questions. I mean, I've looked around me. I've been active in left-wing politics now for almost for 50 years. I've looked around at some organisations on the left and the far left and the Labour Party for that matter, and I've looked at how leadership is exercised, and there appears to be very little democratic involvement by the members, very little genuine democratic accountability, and certainly no removability. And they have not been very good adverts for how power might be wielded under socialism. I can't help thinking sometimes that a society run by the Workers' Revolutionary Party, as it used to be organised, would not have been a very democratic and participatory and inclusive process. In fact, on the contrary. So how we operate and organise now has got to be an advert to people that socialism will be profoundly more democratic in the real sense of the word than capitalism could ever be or would ever dare to be. We have to demonstrate that in our action and our organisation and our accountability today, this side of any revolutionary transfer of power.
Thanks for that, Rob. Moving on to the next question from Mark Blacklock. How can the Communist Party hope to engage with a public which is becoming less and less engaged with politics in general as a result of disillusionment with the main political parties? There is now a void between people and politics, which governments try to bridge using tools of public opinion management and behavioral change, said Alan Finlayson, professor of political and social theory at the University of East Anglia, in The Guardian last week.
Well, I don't believe that the main capitalist party, the first 11 for capitalism in Britain, the Conservative Party, and its supporters in the media and so on, I don't for 1 minute believe that they want to see an active participatory democracy in which a well-informed population participates and elects them and holds them to account. I think they are perfectly happy to put up with a fairly substantial level of apathy as long as it doesn't reawaken and turn in a direction that would threaten their interests. So I'm not at all, surprised. We shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be shocked that many people look at what passes for politics in Britain and it raises no enthusiasm. In fact, on the contrary, it raises only cynicism and apathy about that kind of politics. I think that's what we've got to be clear about. It's their version of politics that people have turned away from. The question is not can we win them back to traditional, safe bourgeois politics, built as it is on deception and flattery and empty promises and so on. It's how can we enthuse people to take part in activity which would be regarded as political, or perhaps not even regarded as political? How can we involve people in activity that begins to change things and gives a glimpse of the potential for even bigger and deeper changes that would directly benefit them, their family, their friends, their neighbours, their community, their workmates, and so on. And from time to time, the Communist Party and other organisations have found ways of doing that. I remember after the Conservative Party election victory, after Labour's defeat in 2010, and then the Conservative Party's achievement of an outright majority in 2015, there was a lot of despondency around. A lot of people, did not feel motivated enough to go out to vote Labour, let alone to vote Communist. But almost immediately after those two defeats, and they were defeats for the Labour movement and the left and the progressive movement, not just for the Labour Party, the People's Assembly swung into action with mobilisations in different towns and cities across Britain. The Communist Party had been heavily involved in the formation of the People's Assembly from the beginning, as had a whole number of organisations in which we were playing quite a leading role alongside others. And in that way, we managed to build a movement against austerity, in particular, that has undoubtedly, helped by the financial crash, of course, but has helped to discredit the whole notion of austerity politics, that working class people, public services, public sector pensions, local community facilities must pay the price for capitalist crisis of capitalism's financial system and so on. So we saw an upsurge of activity. And again, the anti-war movement, CND, Stop the War Coalition, again with communists playing a leading role in those organisations, by the way in which we built that tremendous movement against the war in Iraq. We didn't stop that war, although I remember Andrew Murray saying we might not have stopped the Iraq war, but we almost certainly stopped the next war, which we did, which was going to be against Syria. And enough MPs had seen the power of the anti-war movement and the popular feeling that we'd built up that they defeated that first attempt for us to go to war in Syria. And even now the British ruling class only goes to war in Syria surreptitiously and not openly. And so, it is possible to enthuse people, to mobilize them, to bring them into activity, to make them see what's possible. But there's always the problem of how do you sustain that? How do you broaden it out onto other important fronts and so on? We had a great campaign going by the public sector unions against the attack on public sector pensions. But in the end, we had some separate settlements reached by different unions, broke the unity of that particular campaign, which was linked up with the whole mass movement against austerity. And in the end, that campaign against the cuts in public sector pensions went down to at least a partial defeat. So there's always that problem of how we maintain those movements. But can they be built? Yes. Can they be linked up? Yes. Does having a much stronger Communist Party help in that? I'd have to say yes as well. We've got a great campaign going. I'll finish on this. We've got a great campaign going in Suffolk, where some people who've joined our party, disillusioned with what's been happening in the Labour Party of late, they've decided to join the party of working class power and socialism, the Communist Party. And they and some of our existing members have got a great campaign going in a number of towns in Suffolk. They're calling it Toothless in Suffolk. There are no NHS dental services for many, many miles. So they've gone into the town centre with stalls, with petitions, with campaigning activity. They've got the support of the British Dental Association and so on. They've gone into those towns and cities and they've started to build a real popular campaign because people need dental services without having to pay the fortune that sometimes you have to pay with quite a few of the private dental practices and so on. So again, it needs boldness, it needs imagination, and it has to be a genuinely broad-based campaign that you build, not a crude front for the Communist Party or a front for some Trotskyist organisation and so on. Link up with the health sector workers and their unions, link up with the professional associations, but most of all, bring local people into something that is directly related to their interests. And by the way, that campaign is now being replicated in other cities and towns in Britain, in the same way that the Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise campaign has been replicated in some other parts of Britain. What we've got to do is to build all of these things up and join them up where they clearly share common aims and common interests. So it can be done. Can we revive mass interest in safe bourgeois politics that will not challenge the economic and social status quo? I don't think we should be doing that particularly, although a Labour government might bring some reforms we wouldn't get from a Conservative government. But I think our priority has to be to build up those grassroots campaigns and grassroots movements.
Thanks for that. Thanks a lot for that, Rob. We've got another half an hour left, so I'm sure we can get a few more of these questions. Tony Conway would like to ask, what lessons can be learned from the actions in today's South and Central America?
Well, some pretty fundamental lessons, to be honest. Of course, there have been many positive features about some of the movements that have emerged in Latin America and the gains they've made. The fact that they've taken office for state power. In some places, they appear to have achieved it, but then, there's the counter-revolutionary activities, the movement is thrown back, and so on. And therefore, unity and clarity and strategic direction, unity around a clear strategic direction, I think has been one of the problematic factors in the tremendous, bold and heroic processes that we've seen in some Latin American countries. And we have to be, I think there has to be realism at the different stages of the revolutionary process. I went to Venezuela when Chavez was in power, and it was a question of power and not just office, or at least a partial power. One could even say dual power. But I went to the Congress of the Venezuelan Communist Party, met government officials, trade union leaders, trade union activists, rank and file activists, but also met members of the Socialist Party that Chavez and his supporters had formed. Had some very good discussions. They wanted to know why the Venezuelan Communist Party had not simply dissolved itself and joined their organization. But the reasons for that became quite clear. Not just after talking to the Venezuelan communists, who of course supported the revolutionary process, but also from talking to some of the Chavez supporters themselves. They believed that they had achieved socialism. And I couldn't help but think that this was a profound misreading of the situation. And it certainly wasn't the assessment that the Venezuelan communists had. Large sections of the mass media, not the state sector, which was small, but large sections of the mass media were still in corporate capitalist ownership, pumping out the anti-government, anti-socialist, anti-revolutionary propaganda. Key sectors, most of the key sectors of the economy and land ownership were still in private hands. There wasn't a clear strategy to build up a public sector industrial base, and therefore an industrial proletariat, if you like, an industrial working class in Venezuela. And I met long-standing Venezuelan revolutionaries and communists and socialists, some of whom had been very close to Chavez at various points and so on, but who said what they hadn't succeeded in doing was convincing the revolutionary government and Chavez and his party that a high priority must be given to building a state sector in industry so that there would be a much bigger industrial section of the working class and an industrial section of the working class outside the influence of the handful of big capitalist employers and their stooge trade unions. So, there are lessons, and of course, there was the view as well that I met there and in one or two other Latin American countries that the revolution had been won and had succeeded. They had state power. Now it was a question of how they wielded it. There wasn't such a priority given, in some cases, to how the revolution should defend itself, because counter-revolution hadn't finished. In fact, it was only just beginning. And whilst the United States, US imperialism had suffered defeats in a number of those Latin American countries, they hadn't given up. They hadn't given up. They were working out how best they could launch the fight back in alliance with local reactionary forces and so on. And of course, that is the process that we've seen now in a number of the Latin American countries where left-wing and revolutionary leaderships have been replaced. Some of them have won back a certain amount of their position, as in Bolivia and so on. But the struggle between revolution and reaction in Latin America is very far from over. And there was never a time at which the revolutionary forces could have said, with any sense of realism, that this revolution had succeeded, and now it was simply a question of how they go forward. The forces have always been there, planning and plotting to overturn the revolution and the gains that had been made. And so the struggle goes on in Latin America. The communist parties, again, in some of these countries, were not very developed, were not very strong. And I think, again, the revolutionary governments and revolutionary movements suffered as a result of not having much stronger Marxist-Leninist parties. I'm glad to say in countries such as Chile, we're seeing the communist parties making significant advances. And the next time the revolutionary moment comes around in some of those countries, with much stronger communist parties and a bigger industrial working class, the prospects will be, I think, brighter, not only of seizing power, taking power, but of maintaining power.
Thanks for that, Rob. Moving to the next question, we've got a question by Matthew Brooks, who's asking, will there be need for the nation state after the revolution?
Well, state power has to be exercised to prevent counter-revolution, to dispossess the capitalist class, and to operate and enforce socialist policies. At which levels does that state power need to be exercised? Again, it's a very important question. Thank you, Matthew. Not least here in Britain. I think, though, my starting point would be, and Matthew's not implying this in his question, but I know those on the left who say, well, capitalism is international, imperialism is international, the days of the nation state are over. Talking about taking state power at national level is just the old Stalinist socialism in one country argument. It's out of date and so on. I think that is a profoundly wrong reading of the realities of where we are. The big capitalist monopolies ensure that state power is operated primarily at the level of the nation state. That is the source of much of the state power that serves their interests, and they know it. And they know it. It doesn't mean they're not prepared to cooperate internationally and to take that to quite a significant level, which, of course, is what the European Union is, in essence. It's an alliance of capitalist state powers. It's dominated by the strongest of those state powers, in particular German state monopoly capitalism and French state monopoly capitalism. And behind that comes Italy, the Netherlands, and so on and so on. But it's an alliance of capitalist state powers. But ultimately, the European Union still rests upon the state power of the monopoly capitalists in France, the state power of the monopoly capitalists in Germany, and their hired and tame politicians. So state power is still essential for the functioning, the protection, the promotion of capitalism and its interests around the world as well as at home. And therefore, for as long as state power of the capitalist class in Britain is concentrated at British level, that is where the class struggle has to be fought primarily in terms of the struggle for state power, to take that state power out of the hands of the capitalist class. We also, of course, have the historic nations of Britain, and we now have devolved institutions in Wales and Scotland, although they are still relatively weak and certainly don't have the resources that it would enable them to intervene decisively against capitalist market forces. That's why one of the major policies that we discussed at our most recent Communist Party Congress, our 56th Congress, was our policy of progressive federalism, that the parliaments of Scotland and Wales and regional assemblies in England and an English parliament should have the powers and the resources to be able to intervene decisively at their level of the operation of the capitalist economy. And those powers need to be entrenched. And under capitalism, the only way in which they would have any degree of entrenchment would be by having a system of federalism combined with a radical redistribution of wealth from the capitalist class to the working class everywhere, not just to the working class in Wales and Scotland, but to the working class in all the regions of England and so on. So state power, is what has to be fought for and what has to be won, but it has to be won at the levels where it already exists. And this was one of the reasons why the Communist Party has never had any doubt at all about the class character of the European Union and its forerunners, and why we believe that we must try and ensure that state power, as much as possible, remains in Britain and is there to be captured rather than to be centralised upwards in institutions and structures that don't even have a level of bourgeois accountability, of parliamentary accountability, as could be operated in Britain if we had the kind of left government that was prepared to attempt to do that. So, I don't know if, again, I don't know if that fully answers Matthew's question. But of course, over time, if we have left governments, if we have working class state power and the building of socialism in different countries, and almost certainly there would be some synchronicity here, it's difficult to envisage the political and economic conditions being so different in Britain from those in Germany or France or Italy or Belgium, that Britain would be steaming ahead on the road to socialism, whilst next to nothing is happening in Germany or France or whatever. We're all affected by international economic forces as well as national ones, and we have the power of the multinational corporations, although they're all ultimately based in one major capitalist state or another. So over time, of course, there would have to be, and not just, we don't have to wait for revolutionary transitions for this. Our party has links with more than 100 communist and workers' parties and national liberations around the world. They're very valuable, very fruitful links. But of course, links between socialists and communists and working class organizations internationally are valuable here and now. The solidarity is valuable here and now. The exchange of news and views and lessons to be learned is valued now. And when we get a left government in Britain and we have the beginnings of a real revolutionary process, it's difficult to conceive of this not also happening to some extent at a faster or slower pace and in different forms in other major advanced capitalist countries. So not only does that immediately raise the question of links and solidarity right up the agenda, but when we have left governments, and certainly when we have left governments with state power, not just left governments, but the whole movement with state power, then of course the basis is then being created for deeper forms of cooperation. And once more, we can look to the Soviet Union, we can look to Comecon, we can look to different arrangements that were attempted then to try and bring about specialization in particular sectors of the economy, in particular countries and so on. But clearly the basis can be laid for deeper forms of economic and social and cultural and political cooperation. But that would still ultimately rest on state power being exercised in those different countries. Over time, as socialism has to be internationalist, over time, of course, there would be the construction of international institutions, a reinforcement perhaps of a more democratic and more progressive and an anti-imperialist United Nations may be a possibility. But certainly international institutions and structures could be built where there is a more genuine sharing of power between the revolutionary movements and governments of different countries that are taking the road to socialism.
We've got an interesting question by Andy Till, who wants you to talk a bit about the structure of the Marxist-Leninist parties. He asks, what is special about Marxist-Leninist parties that make them historically able to make and maintain revolutions?
Well, first of all, in terms of those parties, for as long as they remained based on the ideas of Marx and Lenin, the revolutionary ideas of Marx and Lenin, and enriched those and developed those on the basis of new experience and new lessons learned and so on, and elaborated those theories, that ideological strength was a major source of the overall political strength of those parties. Of course, over time as well, we've seen how reformist ideas and revisionist ideas can also take root in communist parties, and they move away from principled positions that should be common to all communist parties based on the ideas of Marx, Engels and Lenin. So that's been a major source of strength. I think there have been two other factors I would emphasize straight away. Firstly, yes, understanding the character and the ruthlessness of the class enemy, if you like, forces communist parties to have a high sense of discipline, to have rules and structures that ensure that when that party goes into action, whether in terms of the battle of ideas or on the industrial front or for peace or for democratic rights or whatever, that it does so as a united and disciplined force. We don't underestimate the power of the capitalist class and the capitalist monopolies. We don't let it produce an air of gloom and defeatism in our ranks or in the ranks of the wider labour movement and so on. It's never so powerful that it can't be challenged and can't be overthrown. But nevertheless, we have to understand the strength and the power that the capitalist monopolies and their state can draw upon, especially in the face of any serious threat to their prerogatives and their interests. And therefore, you will have no chance of pursuing a successful challenge to the policies or the interests of the capitalist class if you are not yourself a united and very disciplined force. However, of course, we've also seen how that can be abused. The centralism, the centralized discipline of communist parties can be undermined and abused and misdirected when the democratic component of what we call democratic centralism is also abused or ignored or downplayed. And therefore, communist parties have to, and we do our best. You know, we fall some way short of sainthood, no doubt, but we do our best to draw upon the experience, the initiative, the talents, the skills, the interests, the commitments of our members. And that must mean as well involving them in the formation of policy, in the election of the leadership. You know, our leadership is elected every 2 years at a congress of elected delegates of rank and file organizations. Those elections are not in any way managed or rigged. The Congress is not presented with a single list and told vote for or against it. It's a secret ballot. You can cast your individual votes, 32 of them at the last Congress. You can cast them as you like. You can cast them for whichever individuals you want to see elected to the executive and make sure you're not voting for those you don't believe deserve a place at the executive or won't help to produce the best leadership for the party. And that leadership has to be capable. The members have to be empowered to change that leadership, to change it substantially, to sack it if necessary. People have to be free to stand for elections in the Communist Party at every level, and they are. People have to be able to vote against anybody who's standing for election, and they are. And that power is untrammeled. And it's when parties ignore that democracy or limit it or even in some cases abolish it. That's when, of course, centralism also can be grossly abused. So democratic centralism is an essential principle for us, but that centralism has to be democratic. But it also, that party has to be based on the ideas of Marx, Engels and Lenin, but not fossilized ideas, ideas that take into account new developments, that learn lessons from experience, that discuss mistakes honestly and openly, and try and rectify them and take the necessary measures.
Cheers for that, Rob. Really detailed responses you've got. Andreas Bieler would like to ask, is it sufficient to talk about state monopoly capitalism in times when transnational capital has arguably emerged as an actor in its own right, colluding with different governments at the same time?
Well, the big capitalist monopolies that operate, across different countries, and in that sense are transnational, of course, will use any means that may be at their disposal to play off one government against another, and so on. And but we've had transnational corporations in various forms since at least the East India Company many centuries ago and before that. And in one sense, yes, we can call them transnational companies, and they operate across national boundaries, and they're a very powerful force now, much more powerful, much more widespread than they were 100 years ago. However, almost all of them are still ultimately based in one or other of the leading imperialist countries. And we saw what that means in practice demonstrated quite dramatically at the time of the financial crash. The British government and the British state acted to rescue the British-based financial monopolies. We didn't bail out the American ones or the German ones. The British state, the British ruling class, acted to protect what it believed were the British ones. That doesn't mean they don't have foreign shareholders. It doesn't mean they don't have some people on the board of directors who are from outside Britain. And in some cases, there are a handful of quite powerful transnational corporations that are almost equally divided in terms of the nationality, of their chief directors, of their board of directors, and they can have head offices, in more than one country. And of course, we've got one or two well-known examples of that in Britain with Shell and the rest of it. But in most cases, those companies have originated in a particular capitalist state and are still based there, and the financial interests tied up in them are still predominantly those of that particular country. So the US government intervened to rescue US financial institutions, US financial markets. Some of them were allowed to go under, of course. Some of them were beyond rescue. But we saw exactly the same thing in Germany, exactly the same thing in France, and so on. And when governments, of course, those governments can have common interests. They all ultimately want to see any barriers to foreign capital in third world countries. They want to see those barriers broken down so that their own multinationals can trample over them. But it would also mean other multinationals can do the same. So they're rivals, but at the same time they can have common interests. So no, most multinational or transnational corporations, do have a nationality. It doesn't mean that they're fanatically inward-looking, or that they're xenophobic, or that they're nationalistic, highly nationalistic, but they do know which state power they can rely upon in many circumstances to act in their interests. Same with the big giant armaments companies, same with most of the big oil companies and so on. They know which state power is theirs, and they make sure that they can maintain their influence over that state power and see that that state power is used to their advantage against their rivals from other countries.
That's great, Rob. I'm going to take two more questions. We haven't got much time, and we've got two really good questions, one on the question of gender and one on the question of racial matters. Kirill Whitaker would like to ask Rob, Uncle Ho Chi Minh stated without the liberation of women, socialism would only be half established. In Vietnam, this has been shown through extremely progressive women's rights in the workplace, among other things. How do you think a British path to socialism liberates women aside from surplus value extraction? And I'll just ask the final question before we finish. How would the Communist Party relate to movements and struggles such as Black Lives Matter?
Yes, the militant involvement and participation at every level, including in the leadership of women in any revolutionary process, is absolutely essential in late 20th century and in 21st century Britain and in the other advanced developed countries. Of course, it should be mandatory everywhere, but we know how very often the oppression of women the inequalities that exist, the discrimination against women, sometimes quite often that process lags some way behind other progressive political developments and even revolutionary developments. Not to draw fully upon the talents and skills and commitment and vested interests in revolutionary change that many, many women have, of course, immediately means that the movement is denying itself what in any modern society would be an essential component for advance and for revolutionary change. And that flows from our fundamental analysis of capitalism, of course, that women have played an absolutely critical role in as a cheap way in which the maintenance and replenishment and reproduction of labour power takes place for direct exploitation in work, but also for the role that women have played as part of a reserve army of labour, as part of an emergency labour force, as a source of super exploited labour, and so on. So that link between capitalist exploitation and the oppression of women is a very important one that I think actually our party and if I may name an individual, Mary Davis, have played an essential part in explaining, uncovering and explaining that link is very important. But it's not just about the economics, of course. It's about the role that 50 or 51% of the population has to be playing and has an essential part in playing in any revolutionary process. And we have to demonstrate, the left and socialist and communist parties have to demonstrate now, well this side of any revolutionary process, we have to demonstrate that we are serious and committed to encouraging and supporting the participation of women and assisting women to overcome the obstacles that capitalist and patriarchal society have placed in the way of the full involvement of women. We have fallen short as a Communist Party in a whole number of important respects in the course of our history. We've been in advance of the labour movement on a number of occasions, but we've also failed to rectify some real shortcomings in our own party. We are now taking the steps, and we took a big step forward at our 56th Congress. We shouldn't have needed to take it, it should already have been taken. But we've taken a big step forward to significantly increase the proportion of women who are in a position to play leading roles in our party, particularly as members of our executive committee. But we have to look at how we can do that, at every level of the party and on every front of activity by the labour and progressive movements. And we have played a major role recently in launching and popularising the Charter for Women and in rebuilding the National Assembly of Women as a left-of-centre, working-class, anti-imperialist organisation to fight for the rights of women and so on. But there's still plenty more that we can and will be doing over the coming period. In the struggle against racism, again, I think our party actually can be proud of the role that we've played over the decades. At the same time, the Communist Party and others on the left and the labour movement have at times been very slow to take up vital questions and struggles that black people have to fight in order to overcome super exploitation, oppression, discrimination, and so on. As I say, there are episodes in our party's history that we celebrate, but we still have a lot to do. And when spontaneous movements arise, then of course we look to ways in which we can not only support them, but in which we can help to strengthen their links with the permanent organisations of the working class, the left, and so on. Most recently, we've worked hard to what can I say, re-energize liberation, the internationalist, anti-imperialist movement that we have in Britain, that campaigns against all forms of racist discrimination and oppression around the world, not least those that are the product of Britain's imperialist history, as well as Britain's imperialist present. But we've also welcomed the formation of the Liberation Movement as an anti-racist organisation within Britain, in which black people, people from the Bangladeshi community, from the Indian and other communities in Britain, will be playing a prominent part. And again, we as a party have always been a little dubious about those anti-racist organisations that have been set up as fronts from white-led and white-dominated political organisations of the left. Ultimately, that's not doing justice to the issues. We work very closely with the Indian Workers Association. We work very closely with the Bangladeshi Workers' Council. We'll be working very closely with the Liberation Movement and with the internationalist movement Liberation to fight racism, to promote unity in the fight against racism, and to ensure that black people, as well as white people, as well as trade unionists of every ethnic identity and background, that we build united opposition to racism, and we build it on organisations that will have deep roots in the communities that are most directly affected by racism here in Britain.
Thank you very much, Rob. You've covered an incredible amount of ground there. I'm sure I can thank you on behalf of everybody here today. A really interesting talk, really engaging, and you spoke in a way that everybody can understand, which sometimes in these academic research centres is a rarity. So I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the CSSGJ and everybody here. A round of applause. Next week, the CSSGJ will be hosting our final talk of the semester, given by Tony Burns, Why Hegel Still Matters. So if people would like to sign up to that, you're welcome to attend next week. And thank you very much, Rob, for all the effort you put into today. This has already been recorded and that'll be going up online and on YouTube. And I'm sure people will find it very interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Oliver, and to the others who've organised this. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And thank you for the stimulating and challenging questions as well.
Cheers. All the best, everybody.
Thank you, Robert.